Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast where we interview researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health researcher from King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. This week we're talking about artificial intelligence, or AI, and its potential impact on the integrity of elections. A recent report published by AI researcher Sam Stockwell from the Alan Turing Institute sheds light on how AI could threaten the integrity of the upcoming UK general election. We'll unpack the evidence, understand the implications, and discuss recommendations for what governments and regulators need to do to protect our democratic process. How do we measure the impact that AI might be having? Does AI pose real danger to the future of elections across the globe? Let's find out. So I'm really pleased to welcome researcher Sam Stockwell to the podcast today to talk about this report. Hi Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
So can you first tell us what you do and how you got there?
Sure, yeah. So I am what's called a research associate, or in other words, someone that conducts quite similar work to what you would potentially be doing at university. So I typically have a project that I'm working on at any time, and that project will try and answer a series of research questions, as I said, like you would do in a kind of dissertation. And typically, we would do, for instance, a literature review, so scan for news articles, journal articles, public reports to kind of analyze existing information out there, find out the gaps, but also do things such as conduct interviews around the research with experts, convene workshops to bring those sort of experts together, and all kinds of other methods like that. And ultimately, with all that research, what we do is we create a series of different outputs, typically a kind of paper-based report, also kind of an online version, and yeah, that's sort of what I do. And in particular, within the Alan Turing Institute, which is where I'm based, that's the UK's National Research Centre for Data Science and AI. I work within a team called the Centre for Emerging Technology and Security, or CTAS, because it's a bit of a mouthful to say the whole thing all the time, so we shorten it to CTAS. And we are primarily focused around policy research for the national security community. So by that, I mean not necessarily research that's looking into kind of the coding of AI, the development of new AI systems, but more around things such as regulation, policy initiatives that, for instance, the UK government, but also the likes of intelligence agencies, police and law enforcement, and also regulators can implement to better protect the public from different risks around emerging technology like AI. So typically we have a list of recommendations in every report, which tries to help, as I said, improve sort of protecting the public against those risks. So that's kind of a bit about my role. I've been at the Turing for about a year and a half now, and prior to that I was at an organisation called RAND Europe, which was a similar kind of research think tank style organisation where I was working on a broader range of defence and security research, so not just around emerging technology, but also looking at things such as conflict resolution and radicalisation and counter-terrorism. And really, I got into that through King's College London, funny enough. So I did my master's in the War Studies department there way back in 2019. And that was specifically in conflict, security and development studies. So yeah, I'm a former KCL student and alumni. And that's kind of where I got my interest in all of this area.
Nice. So some really big, important topics that you're like covering in your work. So the target audience for the kind of reports that you're producing, is it like governments and organizations and regulators to try and like shape like how we do things?
So I would say, yes, our reports are primarily orientated towards those types of bodies and organisations, and that's because we really try and ensure that governments and regulators and others are putting in measures to protect the public. So yes, with particularly the recommendations, they are directed towards those organisations. But what's really nice about CTAS and the Turing in general is that because we are a kind of public-facing organisation, we are allowed to sort of talk about these topics more openly, which is often a challenge in national security research because naturally lots of information and analysis can be classified so that it doesn't potentially get leaked to, say, foreign adversaries or those that were looking to harm the UK. So what's really nice with our team is that we can hopefully try and make these topics more accessible to the public, make them more aware of the threats, but also ensure that they're being informed by evidence and not necessarily getting kind of swooped up with a lot of the hype speculation, particularly around a topic like AI and elections, given how important this year is for elections.
Yeah, that's really nice to hear. And that's like really what we're all about on this podcast, trying to provide more evidence and make it accessible. So that's really exciting. So in each episode, we dive into the research behind a headline. And this week, we're talking about your report titled AI-Enabled Influence Operations, the threat to the UK general election. And that's been featured in news articles such as Time Running Out for Regulators to Tackle AI Threat Ahead of General Elections, Researchers Warn. And that one was published by Sky News in May 2024. So this was quite a scary read for me because I'm struggling to get my head around the capability of AI and how it could potentially affect like all aspects of society. So I'm really looking forward to kind of learning more about what we know about how it's affecting, like specifically in this example, the next general election happening in July. Let's go straight in with a big question. Why should we be worried about AI and its potential influence on elections?
Sure. So yeah, as I kind of touched upon a minute ago, I think we are in a very unique situation where on the one hand, 2024 has been described by some estimates as the year where we will see the most elections than ever before, with at least 60 countries and over 2 billion people voting. So
Wow.
obviously, this is a very unique year in that there are lots of elections taking place, and a lot of these countries, whether it be here in the UK, but also the likes of India, the US, and France, the outcomes of those elections obviously have important knock-on effects for things such as the situation in the Middle East, but also Ukraine. So on that kind of element, we naturally are probably going to see a lot of interest from foreign adversaries, countries that are hostile to democracy in the West, wanting to try and interfere in those elections. But also we're likely to see domestic actors as well. So, for instance, political extremist groups wanting to try and shape those outcomes as well. So what we also have on the other hand, though, is that in the last 2 years or so, new generative AI systems, so those are tools like ChatGPT, which many listeners may be familiar with, that can essentially allow users through just typing in on your keyboard a couple of prompts or instructions, create very realistic, personalizable content that previously you would never be able to do unless you were really kind of a technical expert in AI. So that's the kind of other thing as well, is that we have that lowering of barriers to access for anyone really to use these tools. And of course, there are lots of benefits that AI brings in that respect. People can now create lots of really cool artwork that previously they would never be able to do. But on the other hand, you also have the risk now that disinformation or the intentional creation and sharing of false news to try and mislead and deceive people will kind of grow exponentially. And then when you couple that with all the elections going on, you kind of have a really toxic formula potentially where all kinds of confusion, all kinds of meddling in election results could take place. So there naturally has been lots of speculation and concern, whether that be through the media, governments, but also the public as well over the last 6 months, given this. And I guess one of the issues is that when you have so much speculation, although it's kind of important to obviously raise awareness of these issues, if we kind of focus too much on what could happen rather than saying what has happened, you run the risk of kind of unnecessarily stoking anxiety. I mean, I kind of read some of these headlines myself in the news about AI and elections and sort of think, well, if I didn't work in this space, I probably would be sharing those sentiments in that, my God, it looks like AI is just going to ruin everything and have a really bad impact. So one of the things that we wanted to do with our report was to say, well, we haven't really seen much reporting on the evidence of, in say the last year, when we've just had these new AI tools be released to the public, what have we actually seen in recent elections around that misuse, and to what extent has it had any impact on things like election results, the information space, all those kinds of things. So that was kind of what we wanted to do with this paper. And as I kind of explained at the beginning, one of the ways we did that was through a literature review, as you would kind of do at university. So we looked through a load of news articles and public reports, tried to find that evidence. And it was actually quite reassuring what we found as one of the key findings, in that despite all this concern and speculation over the threat of AI, what we actually found was only 19 countries out of a total of about 112 which have either taken place and had an election since January of last year, or those that are upcoming still in 2024. So countries like the UK and US. We only saw 19 where there was actually evidence of AI misuse. So when you put that into kind of the perspective of this year and how many elections there are kind of going on, and also elections that have taken place in the last year, it's actually quite a small number.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how you actually measure whether an election was interfered with AI. So like, what does the evidence look like, and how do you measure it? How do you know it's been affected?
That's a really good question. I think there's two questions to unpack there. I think one of them is around how we kind of describe this phenomenon. So we have been really careful to try and avoid too much language like interference, because often when you think of that word, it conjures up all kinds of negative implications, like this idea that AI has interfered with the election, it's had some sort of strong influence on the outcome, it's manipulated it in some major way. But actually we found that wasn't the case when we looked into the specific examples in these 19 countries. So firstly, it was actually really difficult to find any evidence of AI misuse in articles and reports. We had to really dig down into some kind of rabbit holes, as it were, through various pieces of media. And even when we did find those examples, it was often a case that you'd only have one or two pieces of fake content that went viral, which had integrated AI, as opposed to kind of a huge number of, or volume of AI content.
So just to clarify that, when we're talking about whether there's evidence that AI has affected an election campaign, an example of testing that evidence or finding that evidence is, say, an AI generated like deepfake video has gone viral about a certain candidate. But then when you measure the amount of people that voted for that candidate, it hasn't changed since that video went viral.
Yeah, kind of. If you look at kind of the polling data over time, and you kind of look at the period when, or the month or whatever, when that that kind of deepfake went viral, you would maybe see a kind of even like a little spike up or down, well, probably down for the candidate that was targeted in it. But we didn't kind of see any changes like that. It was very much consistent with the rest of the kind of period of 6 months where they did the polling data. There was no weird little spikes in drops or support when those deepfakes went viral. And especially when we looked at polling data, so when we were kind of looking at levels of support for different political candidates in these 19 countries, so places like Argentina, Taiwan, and Poland, we didn't actually see any significant drop in support for a candidate who was, for instance, the target of what are known as deepfakes, or essentially fake AI content that looks really real, and it often implicates a politician or celebrity in a really controversial statement or activity to try and damage their reputation. So when they were kind of implicated in a deepfake that went viral, we saw no evidence of any drop in support for those candidates, which we took as clear evidence that there was no kind of real suggestion that AI had changed a specific election result so far. But what we did see was worrying early signs of these threats damaging the wider democratic system. So we wanted to kind of make the point that we sort of need to focus less so narrowly on the election context, and understand that these threats kind of play and exacerbate existing trends within society that damage our democratic system more wholly. So, for instance, we saw signs of those who were targeted by deepfakes actually receiving online harassment. So even in the UK, back in November of last year, there was a deepfake audio clip of London Mayor Sadiq Khan that went viral, and he was kind of implicated in a very controversial statement that turned out to be AI generated and fake around Remembrance Sunday, and he received a lot of online harassment for that. And in the long term, if we see the continuation of this trend, then it could lead to all kinds of problems, like a chilling effect on the willingness of candidates to participate in future elections, or even threats to their personal security. We also saw evidence of how users were also really struggling to distinguish between whether a deep fake that was labeled as such was authentic or not. So this kind of idea of that because AI now is so realistic in the content it creates, it's becoming so challenging for users to know whether they can actually believe something labeled as a deepfake is legitimate or not. And we saw that in countries like Bangladesh and South Africa. And so, again, in the long term, if we kind of see a continuation of this challenge, this will pose all kinds of challenges for things like fact-checking efforts, which are vital to countering disinformation, but also just trust in the online information space, because people are just going to say, well, I can't guarantee that anything isn't a deepfake anymore, so why should I believe anything I see online? And then finally, we also witnessed a concerning trend where political candidates themselves actually shared deepfakes attacking their rivals, which is obviously not great. So in countries like Argentina, India, and Poland, some of the examples we found, they were only picked up because political candidates in the elections were circulating them on their X or TikTok accounts. And again, that's really problematic because it amplifies that disinformation and it normalizes these quite dangerous tactics, which often can be used by foreign adversaries and domestic extremists. So it's really important that we take into account those kind of issues. But that's kind of a little bit on what we did see. But I think, again, one of the challenges is around measuring impact, as you kind of posed in your other question. So one of the issues is that it's really difficult to separate that correlation from causation argument. So because of the fact that there are so many different factors which influence why someone might vote for a specific person or party, whether it be based on your job or your economic security, your family and kind of friends and how they vote. Just trying to isolate one specific factor like a deep fake attack on whether that influences someone to change who they vote for is basically almost impossible. So one of the kind of things that we kind of recommend in the report as well is that we just need much more long-term monitoring of these types of issues, because also the fact that these elections are so recent, these new AI tools have only been out for a few years, much of that long-term impact is really uncertain, even though we can kind of see some of these early signs that we picked out in the report. So it's really kind of encouraging, people that have an interest in this or work in this space to really try and unpick, through things like social media analysis, whether we can start seeing some longer term trends, but also any impact this might be having on kind of the real world. So whatever happens in the online space, what does that translate to in real life?
Yeah, I think that's what is the most worrying, is like the long-term impact and just being able to get a handle on it or being able to measure it. Because like you said, like you do note in the report that, for example, AI bots on social media can like reinforce echo chambers, which like we see quite a lot. If this is subtly contributing to more polarized views in the background, like how do we know whether an election 10 years time has gone a certain way because of AI or not? I guess like you can't really know for sure. Or do you think that there are ways that we can begin to monitor it and understand the effects better?
Yeah, so this is a question we're actually grappling with at the moment, because we're also commissioning another report that will come out in November, and we're trying to then look back from kind of that point in the year and kind of reevaluate the situation and say, well, for instance, in the UK election, what did we actually see emerge in terms of the AI threat? What impact, if any, did it have? Did it align with some of the predictions and observations we saw in our previous paper, or the one that's come out recently? I think one of them will have to be around that social media analysis I mentioned. So really getting into the weeds of a specific viral deepfake, for instance, and understanding things such as who are those nodes of influence that can spread that disinformation to a wide range of audiences? Is it, for instance, bot accounts, as we kind of pick up in part of the report? So these kind of fake users that are automated through AI, and they can kind of spread large volumes of content really rapidly through social media platforms and then get that viral. And that then risks obviously being picked up by legitimate, real life users. But then there's also the question of, could it just be people that are doing this for kind of a laugh? Trolling and memeing is quite a big culture at the moment, of course. And there's a risk that we might then see that as a kind of knock-on effect from those people, say, circulating these kinds of threats. So again, it's really hard to tell, but I think that's going to be one way to sort of do it moving forward. I think as well, it's also just about joining up the dots between different sectors. So recognizing that we really need to be engaging with social media platforms and their monitoring teams. We need to be organizing and liaising with fact checking groups as well that kind of look into this on a regular basis, because often at the moment it's really challenging to collaborate and kind of utilize the different strengths and techniques of different sectors, because the kind of research space is so fragmented. So yeah, I think one of the things we need to move towards is those kind of better sort of networking and collaborative engagements between these different sectors.
And I guess in terms of like what we can do as individuals, say for the upcoming UK general election that's like just around the corner, is the answer to just try and take control of what you're consuming a little bit more, like maybe read the political party manifestos. For individuals right now, what can we do?
Yeah, I think those are all really sensible points. Yeah, I think really the biggest one for me is just don't get your news entirely from social media. As much as it's really convenient, and you might be, say, scrolling on X or TikTok and you then happen to come across a news story. It's really important that we kind of ensure that we're consuming a variety of news sources. So of course you can still use social media when you kind of want to look into news stories around the election, but also supplement that with more established news organizations like, for instance, the BBC or ITV News, for instance, and also do just kind of little things such as really just checking, for instance, the kind of who is posting this story. Are they, for instance, a official certified news organization, or is it just some kind of unverified user? Do they have kind of other posts on their account? Are they trying to push a particular narrative? Are they citing evidence in their news articles? Is it quite sensationalist? Are they not kind of really focusing on the specifics but making quite grand claims? All of those factors, I think, can contribute to helping to sort of be able to better counteract the perceived effect of disinformation on people. But again, it's really hard. And I mean, what was quite nice to see a few days ago, actually, was that the Electoral Commission, who is kind of the regulator of election integrity, did release a set of guidance documents for voters around disinformation. So if listeners are interested in kind of really learning more about how they can protect themselves, I really suggest them to check out that information.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. We'll definitely link to that on the webpage once the episode is out. I think that's also a really helpful suggestion as well about ways that you can kind of investigate yourself, whether a social media account is potentially posting fake generated stuff. Because of course, like, the opportunity to consume information and news through social media can be very positive. Like, it has opened up a lot of perspectives and we hear from more diverse voices, which is a really positive thing. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot of dangers there too, and there can be a lot of misinformation. So it's really helpful to know like how to look for it. In the report, or in the news coverage of it as well, you've said that the next month, I mean, we're actually only a couple of weeks away, will be critical for UK regulators. Do you know if they've done anything to try and protect against the threat?
Yeah, so we've actually had quite positive discussions with the likes of Ofcom, or the Communication Services Regulator, that has quite a lot of new powers since the Online Safety Act was passed last year, in terms of things such as countering disinformation and making sure that online social media platforms like TikTok or X and others make sure that they're protecting users as well. But also the Electoral Commission, as I said, we've had very positive discussions with both of them. And for instance, we made the recommendation in the report around specifically voter guidance on disinformation. So as I kind of said, that's been kind of published, and they made reference to the fact that we did advocate for that in the report. But equally, the Electoral Commission has put out something as well around guidance and advice for political campaigners. So we kind of were concerned that previously there wasn't any, at least even guidance for those, working or, involved in the election in terms of when they use AI systems to create campaign advertisements. There's nothing stopping them from refraining from saying that this is AI generated, and so kind of the risk of the public being deceived in that respect. So they've now put out that, and kind of that kind of adds that at least some sort of accountability mechanisms and expectations now put on, say, political parties and their supporters to make sure they do things such as add AI labels to their content so that the public can tell that that's AI generated or not. So we've seen great stuff there. I think one of the issues is because how the election took everyone, even I think the government, by surprise when it was announced, and the fact that it's been such a small time window, there really hasn't been much time to make any substantive changes to things like regulation or really kind of institutional structures. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've had. But as I said, I think even just these kind of guidance and policy documents that the likes of the Electoral Commission has put out will go a long way to helping voters stay informed and kind of placing those expectations on political parties to play their role in protecting against election integrity. And I think one of the other things that's reassuring is that the UK government, and it's not quite as well known perhaps, but they have a number of kind of internal bodies who are still running despite the fact that government's been dissolved, around protecting the election from, say, hostile interference. So you have, for instance, the Defending Democracy Task Force, but also the Joint Election and Security Preparedness Unit. So both those groups are responsible for kind of identifying any serious threats from AI or kind of disinformation and foreign interference, and try and root them out. So we kind of been speaking to them. They're doing a lot of great work in this space. And I think it's kind of a bit of reassurance that even though, we might not think there's much being done, actually behind the scenes, there are lots of teams who are busy making sure that nothing's coming through. But I think what's also reassuring is that at least so far, we haven't seen any evidence of kind of really substantial high impact deepfakes or AI threats emerging since the general election was announced. So although it's a little bit sad from a research perspective, because it means I don't have to analyze as much, or can't analyze as much rather, obviously it's great from the perspective of, election security and protecting the public. So, we can't be complacent. That might change in the next few weeks as we reach, closer towards polling day. But I think so far, certainly compared to what we were expecting, as I said, with the kind of the research findings, it seems that the evidence is far less kind of serious or concerning as a lot of the speculation and kind of concern has been in the past 6 months or so.
Yeah, so overall, which is really reassuring, that you didn't find clear evidence to indicate like a clear impact of AI so far on the election campaigns. And I think it's also reassuring to know that there are government bodies and other organizations that are monitoring this and doing something about it, because that's not necessarily public knowledge. I also saw in the report that I think it was in the US, there was an example where there was AI generated information, I think, where that it was suggesting people to go to the wrong places on polling day or at the wrong time, which is really scary. So you haven't seen anything like that so far in the case of this UK election?
No, yeah. So that example was back in January of this year, and that was they called them robocalls, but they're essentially kind of automated telephone calls that get sent out to voters. And that one in particular tried to impersonate Joe Biden, the US president, and encourage voters not to vote in the election because it was seen as helping in some way Donald Trump to get re-elected in the kind of November election. And that was in what's called a primary election, so kind of where US voters can decide who they want to be the next, say, Democrat or Republican candidate to then contest the upcoming presidential election in November. But it was a very interesting and worrying example because, of course, yeah, when you kind of receive a phone call like that, you might be more likely to believe it's real if it's around kind of polling stations rather than, say, a deep fake of a political candidate. But I think what was at least reassuring with that example was we didn't see any evidence that it managed to convince any kind of voters who received it to change their mind over voting, because it was quite a crude sort of example. So the voice was very robotic and it didn't sound very human-like. So it was quite easy to tell that it was fake. But also it was just a bit stupid in that it was kind of giving very weak justifications not to vote. It didn't really make sense, but we didn't see really any impact from that. And we haven't so far seen anything in the UK. But I think one of the issues is that I think is really important for listeners is obviously we've got new voter ID laws that have been introduced in the last few years. So it now kind of requires you to bring along a form of official identification, whether that be a passport or a driving license, along to polling stations alongside, once you've registered, to be able to vote. And I think I'm concerned that we might maybe see some exploitation of that through AI threats like polling disinformation. And I think, again, it's really important that if people are kind of unclear or, not sure around what they need to bring to polling stations, that they check out particularly the Electoral Commission's website, which has kind of official guidance for that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think really the key is if you're really unsure about, you're receiving a phone call or you see something online around polling stations and polling information, your first port of call should always be to go to, for instance, the Electoral Commission's official website, cross-check that. As we were kind of saying, don't just rely on social media to influence your decision. Make sure you check those established websites and authorities before you make a decision. But yeah, it's more around trying to sort of think about ways we can mitigate that threat if it does arise. But as I said, it's not something we've seen so far.
Okay, that is quite reassuring. And also good to know that we can signal people to where to get like the accurate information. We'll definitely link to the Electoral Commission's website on our webpage as well. Do you have any recommendations before we finish if listeners are interested in kind of this topic of like AI and security, AI and elections, if they want to find out more, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So within CTAS, which is the team, as I mentioned, I work in, we're doing lots of publicly available reports on things such as facial recognition, which is kind of AI related. One of my colleagues has also done a report looking at the impact of generative AI on other malicious activities. So not just disinformation, but things like fraud, phishing emails, radicalization efforts. So if people want to kind of learn more about how these systems work, some of the risks and ways we can try and improve the safety of these systems moving forward, they can definitely check out that report on our website or the CTAS website in general. There's also been some work done by others in our kind of institute. So we've got some colleagues in what's known as our public policy program that have done a really interesting survey around how the public rate different measures designed to tackle disinformation. So they can definitely check that out. And then there's also quite a good set of articles by what's called the Brennan Center for Justice, based in America, on a series called AI and Democracy. And that's quite good because it also covers some of the benefits and opportunities which these tools can provide in elections and democratic societies more generally. So things such as the ability to translate voter information and manifestos into different languages so that they're more accessible to people, and also allowing candidates who might not have lots of money to create really professional adverts, and that kind of levels the playing field against some of the political parties that might have better resources. So things like that would also be on that website. So yeah, I think it's also important, to end that we need to kind of recognize that AI in itself is not kind of an inherently evil or bad thing. It's just that there are some people that want to use it for bad purposes. So the more we can kind of do to make ourselves aware of the risks, to protect ourselves against the risks, the more we can kind of open up more of the opportunities that the technology can bring to actually enhance elections and create that accessibility more between the voters and the politicians.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point to end on. We'll definitely post those recommendations on the website. Yeah, I think that's often my worry. Like the way that we talk about AI is like it's its own thing and it's something that we're not really in control of. But I think that's a really important point, that if you have the right like information and knowledge and like regulations in place, that we can potentially like harness it for good instead of it being this, scary thing that we can't control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always sort of say that as a researcher, have to admit I use ChatGPT myself a lot in my day-to-day job because it's really good for kind of summarizing very complex topics and information. But it's also great for kind of all kinds of things around, whether it be, kind of artwork and also helping kind of people to, navigate really complex topics. So yeah, it's really important that we take that kind of balanced approach to the technology and don't kind of just see it as, an inherently bad or evil thing.
Brilliant. So thanks so much for coming on today. I've really learned a lot about AI and elections, how it's potentially affecting or not affecting the current election, and importantly, some really helpful advice on like how to kind of spot it in social media, or like where to go for more information on it. So thank you so much.
No worries, thank you. And yeah, if people are interested, we've got another report coming out in November that will kind of look at those longer term ways we can kind of protect future elections from AI, but also utilize the benefits of that technology as well. So yeah, happy to post that.
So thanks for listening this week, and thanks again to Sam Stockwell for coming onto the podcast today. You can follow us for updates and more information on Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, or on X at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or you have a suggestion for a future topic, then you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. And as always, you can find the researchers' recommendations at www.scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series. Thanks to Kit Studio for the branding and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.